So I've been getting really excited about pre-modern with Eternal Weekend coming up, and there being some events at Eternal Weekend. But one of the decks that I'm kind of interested to look at, and just seems like something that's more on your pace as far as gameplay is concerned, is SWB's Parfait list.
Yeah, he's like told me about it the last couple of times that we played because I played against him on this list at the local. He's been crushing with it at the local the last several weeks. I believe he's undefeated the last 2 weeks playing against this. And I asked him like, how did it feel against all the matchups? And he told me that he hadn't yet played against Replenish, so like it's possible that there would need to be some alterations for that. But like as somebody who's been longing to make Parfait work ever since the banning of land tax, seeing SWB, who's certainly a better player than I will ever be, but like seeing Parfait like in his hands like actually start to gain some momentum and some traction as on the win bracket is really awesome. And like I think that there'll be like some clever things that we'll find today that he's found in terms of like pivoting his plans depending on this given matchups without the raw cards of land tax, and also just like the actual base foundation of what the deck is. Like if you break it down, where like previous Parfait with land tax is like land tax and light and tutor a scroll rack is essentially like a combo almost, like you want your A and your B and then you can ostensibly draw your deck every turn, whereas this is very much like a Gush Mox Diamond, like it's a Gush Geddon deck that happens to have like controlling elements as opposed to something of like what Groatog would have in like, you know, aggressive plans. So let's get into it.
Yeah, let's look at the list here. Finding the right high-end cards for legacy, vintage, pre-modern, or old school Magic can be challenging. That's where friends 3-for-1 trading come in.
3-for-1 Trading is one of Europe's top Magic the Gathering retailers with an incredible selection of premium singles, sealed product, and even full sets, all available with free, fast, and secure worldwide shipping.
They add fresh inventory every Wednesday with weekly deals and discounts. So whether you're hunting for that elusive piece of power, a legacy staple, or something spicy for your collection, they've got you covered.
First high-end orders over $500 or €500, use the code EDFREE to get free worldwide shipping.
Check them out now at the number 3, the number 4, the number 1.gg/ED. That link takes you right to the shop and helps support the channel.
Huge thanks to 3-for-1 Trading for supporting the Legacy community. Now back to the show.
Over here on the field of Mox. If you want to check out this list, you can check it out right here. This is SBW's list. There we go. Give you a second to go ahead and hit that on your phone, and then go look at the list live on Moxfield as well. Hey, also as a heads up to anybody that is watching this, we finally got our affiliate link with TCG Player. So if you're thinking about buying any of the cards for this list, go down to the first pinned comment. We'll have a link to our thing there. Bookmark it if you buy cards a lot, and you don't have to do anything else, and you're already helping out the show. Just plug ourselves there. But let's talk about this list, Phil, because there's a lot of interesting stuff with this. I had a previous Parfait list myself, but there were a lot of changes that I had to make to skirt this over. One of them being like, you're no longer on the Manland plan.
Yeah, instead, like this being a Gush Geddon deck, but like the backbone of the deck being Mox Diamond Gush, and then he's running 2 Armageddon. He's got 2 Gaia's Blessing to cycle all that back. But going up the cards with Gush and Scroll Rack, that's like, of course, the place to go. That's like also where I've gone trying to figure out Parfait is you just Gush back because Gush is the best thing that you can be doing with Scroll Rack in order to get some velocity. He's down to 3 Scroll Rack because drawing the second one is typically not very good, but you do want to see the first. And Scroll Rack also is the means by which you can put back the 2 thick fatties that are your Oath targets in Shard Phoenix and Ancestors Chosen. And you'll see like the numbers post board, the plan for like when Oath of Druids is bad, it's like, well, yeah, against something like Replenish, where it's like I mentioned where like Funeral Pyre is an instant that can like give an opponent a creature, so you could trigger your Oath of Druids against a deck that otherwise doesn't put creatures into play. But then the result of that is 2 creatures that then don't do anything reasonable or that you would care about against the deck that like if you were, let's say, against Replenish or against a deck where like they don't care if you gain a bunch of life. That's not what the game is about. They don't care.
And
if
a
you
Shard
have
Phoenix isn't really doing it for you. Yeah,
right. That's not what the game is about. So it's like if your payoff is not what either of the game is about, okay. The pivot plan then boards into actually clocking those opponents between Meddling Mage's additional disruption and getting in. Meddling Mage doesn't need any introductions. It's been in the sideboard of these kinds of decks for a long time. Just name like the critical spell if you're playing against whatever you're playing against. But then he also has the Call of the Herds as a way to like actually get the beatdowns on. And so like that, removing the oath package and is boarding into this creature package, and then you can actually really apply some deep pressure by your counter spells, staying up on cards against them, naming a critical spell with Meddling Mage, but then you can actually then go after their lands with a pair of Armageddons, where once you're ahead, then you Armageddon, then you just play like, essentially like the Terravor style, like Terrageddon strategy, where you're like, I'm going to put some creatures into play, apply some pressure and disruption, and then I'm just going to wrath your mana base.
I mean, you can also assume out of the board that your opponent might not really realize that this is the plan you're taking.
Mm-hmm.
So you're not probably going to have to name like Swords to Plowshares against your average opponent who may have sided those out.
But also, even if they kept their Swords to Plowshares in, Swords to Plowshares is notoriously not very good against Call to Hurt.
Exactly. Yeah, or Meddling Mage for that matter. Just like it's a 1-for-1, sure, but like now you have to use, and you can't use it like in response to it because it's an as it enters the battlefield thing. It's a whole thing. But Phil, I want to highlight some cards in this deck. One, something I learned today. I feel like I kind of knew, but I kind of forgot that Zur's Weirding was in a Pro Tour deck. Like I assume this is from the 1995 season, the home handicap season. But I want to talk about this card and explain its place in the deck, because I also played this in my original Parfait list. And I just kind of want to highlight the power of this card.
Yeah, I mean, the card absolutely slaps. Once the game is locked up, the game is locked up.
Yeah. So if you're in a situation where you have like the Ivory Tower and you're gaining more than 2 life a turn, right? You could basically, like, let's talk about this card. All players with their all cards play with their hands face up, and then whenever any player draws a card, any other player can pay 2 life to force them to discard that card. Which is, if you get to a point where your opponent has no relevant threats and you're gaining more than 2 life a turn off of the Ivory Tower, you just win. You locked your opponent out. The game is over.
And that pairing comes with Gaia's Blessing. The Gaia's Blessing means that you can deterministically never deck. And so if they choose to put the Gaia's Blessing into the graveyard, it'll just shuffle your graveyard back in. And if they let you keep it, you just cast it. And because there's more than one, if they let you draw both, you can just cycle each other back in. And so as long as you're able to offset the life loss or maintain your life total, you can make it so that they never draw another relevant spell. And so the game is otherwise locked, and that's it.
And you know what's in their hand, so you can actually definitively be like, you're never going to win the game.
Oh yeah. I've been trying to make Wand of Denial work for like the last month and a half, at least. And
this is just better Wand of Denial, right?
It's better Wand of Denial once you're in that space. Yeah, like once you're at the point where you know that they don't have any relevant action in their hand and they have to top deck, then you can get into those spots. The tricky part is if you're playing against a deck that has a lot of selection, like Zur's Weirding, I imagine, is not very good against like, the mono blue dreadnoughts of the world, where every card that they cast or draw could be like Portent, Opt, Sleight of Hand, Impulse. Like if every card you don't actually know what it is, that can be tricky. And you never want to see a second Zur's Weirding, hence as a one of. But like for those spots where it's just like another piece that can lock it out, I think of it similar to like you can pick and choose whether or not you want Armageddon or whether or not you want Zur's Weirding, depending on the matchup. And Armageddon typically will win you a lot of games. Zur's Weirding also will typically win you a lot of games in the matchups where you want.
Yeah. So, I mean, let's talk about what this deck's plan actually is, because, we're talking about kind of the synergies of the deck and stuff, but like, what does this deck actually do, Phil?
This is like at baseline, it's a blue-white X control deck. Your Swords to Plowshares counterspell, accumulated knowledge, selection with Portent, and then your splash is for Oath of Druids and Gaia's Blessing. Gaia's Blessing, like there have been times where I've like not actually had very many green sources, or just like inadvertently with like Undiscovered Paradise or whatever had green sources in my deck for Gaia's Blessing when that's not the plan. This one actually has a payoff for green, which is Oath of Druids, and that payoff is instead of something like where Wrath of God would be or something like that if you were in a harder control deck, or where like Decree of Justice would be with like the landstill type decks, and that is because like for Oath of Druids, if you flip over Oath of Druids and then or off of Oath of Druids, if you put a Wrath of God into play off your Shard Phoenix and Wrath the table against creatures, or if you just gain so much life that you blind combats for however long, and then that also works with Zur's Weirding, where you've gained so much life that ostensibly you'll be able to
Well, I think, Phil, something that's important to kind of note about this deck is a deck that has Oath of Druids in it, but the plan isn't like do Oath of Druids stuff, right? Like Oath of Druids.
I think the plan, the part of Parfait which I like is that's like the anti-creature package, which just could be more removal or more like wrath type effects, but instead it's just leaner. And it's leaner, I think, because in my experience, whenever you're playing Gush, and this is a 4 Gush deck, it's really hard to play anything that costs more than 2. Because anytime you Gush, you're setting yourself so far back. Now, there are the things that do cost more than 2 in this deck are either your payoffs to Oath, so they don't count, or the like absolute haymakers that ostensibly end the game when they resolve. Like if an Armageddon resolves, presumably the game is over. If Zer's Weirding is put into play, presumably that means that the game is over. So those are the only, like if you notice, like anywhere in the 75, like outside of Call the Herd as like the one change because it's looking to get a little bit aggro, everything else in the deck is 2 or less mana. That's where Oath of Druids comes in. And that's similar to what we saw in like the old Parfait decks, even with land tax. Granted, like you had Enlightened Tutor, so you more reliably could find your Oath of Druids when you needed it. But like that was still part of that was the game plan. Like most of the payoffs were on Oath of Druids, and then there was like some flexibility within that because, you know, the raw cards that you would be able to generate off of land tax. But the real bottleneck as to like why you would keep your curve low is Gush. And if you're playing and getting into that space. And then if you're already interested in playing Scroll Rack does let you offset the downside of, you know, inadvertently drawing one of your thick creatures that you want to Oath with. So
not to mention your extra oaths, you know.
So if you think about like what is actually dictating the terms of design in this deck, it's Gush.
Yeah. It's interesting now that you say that, because initially my point there was that because you're only playing 3 green land mana sources, and then you have the Mox Diamonds as well, you're very unlikely to be like turn 2 slamming it. You know, like this is something you'll get it a turn 2 Oath win occasionally because you've been able to gain so much life or whatever and stop an aggro deck. Or you'll be able to wrath the board against an elf deck with the Shard Phoenix or something like that. But for the most part, your plan is to be the blue-white control deck and end the game ostensibly with either a Armageddon that makes it so your opponent just doesn't get to play the game anymore, or a Zer's Weirding that says this is it. You're not doing anything else for the rest of the game.
Yeah, and I think there's a subtle nuance in like the choice of numbers. Like if we look at Gush and accumulated knowledge as both the way to just go up raw pieces of cardboard in hand to supply for Scroll Rack. That presumes that then you're spending your early turns, like you're spending your turn 2, either removing a threat or you're cantripping your AKs or finding a means to like go up those resources depending on what you need to do in the early game. And that is different from what Parfait was with land tax, where it's like ideally you went land tax on 1, Scroll Rack, and then we're off to the races, right? In that case, you really always wanted to find your Scroll Rack because you always were interested in more or less like in the dark. You're like, I would love to slam this on turn 2 so I can just start, you know, essentially drawing most of my library every turn. That is not the case for this type of deck that wants to spend the early turns sort of developing, you know, making sure that it has the pieces that it needs before it then goes to resolve one of those big ways to like go up resources and then play the Scroll Rack and then start churning through. So in that regard, it's like you always want to see a Scroll Rack, but you don't want to cast it and you don't want to see it in your opening hand necessarily. So I think that like the difference between 3 and 4 in a Parfait deck, it's like I think it's because the shift from land tax to Gush is it's subtle, but like that missing Scroll Rack for me is like a real sign as to like, okay, what is the deck actually trying to do when you're keeping an opening hand that's different from old Parfait lists, and how you have to view it through that, even though it's using a lot of the same pieces, the way that you would navigate the game, I think, is very different. And the biggest declaration of that to me is not playing the 4th Scroll Rack.
Yeah. I think something else is worth mentioning is the like gear shift of what to do with an Enlightened Tutor at different stages of the game with this deck. Because if it was turn 1 for me and I didn't have a Mox Diamond already, my turn 1 would be like end of your turn, go get a Mox Diamond, next turn, play Mox Diamond, discard a land, probably play another land, and then cast like a 3-drop. Not a 3-drop, but like use all 3 mana if I could, like either cast an Oath, cast a cantrip, or like try and get a Gaia's Blessing off to like cycle that land back into the deck. But in the mid game, I think it really comes down to like what you. I think Enlightened Tutor is the most potent in the mid game with this deck because you have a lot of options, right? You can be like, okay, do I want to get ahead on mana? Do I want to be in a situation where later in the game, like once I Armageddon, I've set myself up, maybe I get a diamond, right? Okay, do I need to gain life right now? How am I doing that? Am I playing Ivory Tower or am I playing Oath of Druids and hoping to hit Ancestors Chosen, right? Do I want to think about starting to close the door? Am I going to go get Zer's Weirding, right? I think, and obviously there are a couple other cards in here like Seal of Cleansing and stuff like that you can answer, like Silver Bullet answer stuff. But I think for the most part, it's there as you're telling your opponent with this card what stage of the game you're on.
Yeah, I think something that I think typically goes overlooked as well as to like where the value of an Enlightened Tutor comes from. I remember there being like some amount of discourse about like what was the correct number of Enlightened Tutor back in the old Parfait days. I personally was a 4 of Enlightened Tutor truther in that like I always wanted to like your plan is to assemble a land tax plus scroll rack, and if you can just essentially have copies 5 through 8 of either half of whatever you need, that's really valuable. And then that also lets you offset and be able to play a bunch of bullets across your 75. I think the thing that was always underrated that I always really appreciate when I would play or when I was like, goldfishing the deck was how Enlightened Tutor is an instant speed shuffle effect for your scroll rack. And that it like when at the last LobsterCon where I played a variation of Parfait, I was really digging deep for ways to get instant speed shuffle effects, almost to the point where I was like, am I supposed to be playing like
Soldier of Fortune?
Am I supposed to be playing like there was a point where I was like, I need to like I would have Portent and I would like be putting back a bunch of lands, and then I would have to draw a land before I could shuffle with Portent because it was a sorcery. And I was like, oh man, am I supposed to like be using these portents as something else that like should I just be going bigger and playing like Intuition to get an instant speed shuffle that works with the AKs, but then also like works sort of similar to the Enlightened Tutor type stuff? Is there other ways? Like I was playing a lot of Sylvan. I experimented with a lot of Sylvan libraries as more ways to go up a bunch of cards. That way I could play more Enlightened Tutors, but that like had detriment on the mana because then you're stressed between like getting a green mana for Sylvan library versus islands for Gush. And like as a Parfait player, I've always been like, okay, well, the trick to making a good Parfait deck is how can I be ostensibly a 5-color mono blue deck where I only as many islands as possible. And so like there was a point where I was playing Mental Note and just more Gaia's Blessings. That way I could like put the Gaia's Blessing on top of the deck with Scroll Rack and then Mental Note in the upkeep to like
get that
shuffle the deck back. That way I could, just as like once you went up a bunch of cards, I was like, I just want to be able to get these shuffle effects. That way I can always clear the top. So that like there's a lot of interesting tension there. And so like there's a lot of subtle nuances from like the experimentation that I've done with my versions of Parfait and then seeing what SWB is doing and crushing with and going, okay, so he's found that like for Portent and or no like not splitting, like it's like Portent is the thing. And I agree, it's the best cantrip. So it's like, and a lot of your action is at instant speed, whether it's Gush, Counterspell, AK, your Swords to Plowshare. So you can actually operate like you don't really mind too much the slow trip. And it is the best selection for what you're getting, but it doesn't let you do the instant speed shuffle effect. I think the other like very nuanced thing that I want to touch upon, and let me know if I'm starting to like get a little erratic with where we're going here. But like,
no, go ahead.
I find that like the choice of Ivory Tower in a 2 Armageddon deck is also like a very clear choice for like how you're anticipating piloting the deck.
It's
right?
giving what is it? The Showdown in New York vibes to me.
Well, it's like I think the contention between what your life gain spell would be off of like in your Enlightened Tutor package.
Yeah, because you could go with like what's the cycling one, right? You could
play Renewed Faith.
You could play
as
Renewed
option.
Faith and like cycle it for the most part, but then also like get it back. Occasionally, what is it? 6 life, gain 6 life. But like
if you need just the big bump. Yep.
With Armageddon, you're not going to get to 3 mana that often. So like you might, but like you're not going to always have three mana, right?
Yeah, I actually think the biggest contender for Ivory Tower is Zurin Orb.
Zorb, yeah.
You're playing Zurin Orb with like that's not a new thing. Like Zurin Orb plus Armageddon like is
also
is a known
giving
commodity.
Showdown in New York vibes.
But I think really what that like what Ivory Tower suggests to me is that the play pattern that you're actually like trying to set up with all of the different selection and what Scroll Rack is doing and how you're putting the components together, it's like if I were to take this deck into an event, I would be thinking to myself, okay, what I actually want to do is what this deck, like at first glance, seems to be suggesting is the powerful thing, which is Gushgeddon. You're not looking to like sack all your lands to gain a bunch of life and then Gaia's Blessing them back. In that case, I would expect there would be more Gaia's Blessing if you were playing Zernorb.
I actually wanted to speak on Gaia's Blessing here. Eternal Durdles is proud to be sponsored by Moxfield.com. Moxfield is the best deck building website on the internet. You can find all of my and Phil's decks in links below, including decks from this episode. And if you do, you'll be directly supporting the channel. Is the 2 Gaia's Blessing in this deck. I know that for my druthers, and I know why, so I'm going to explain that part too, but for my druthers, I like 3, because if one gets countered and the other hits your yard, you need the third one, right? Like, so, but in this deck, I think that 2 is the correct number, not to mention the fact that, like, where are you going to cut? Like, everything is kind of very tight in this deck, but I think 2 is the right number in this deck because you're going to rely on your Scroll Rack and your Oath of Druids to be the thing that procs the Gaia's Blessing. Whereas in a deck that's like, 5-color control or something like that, where you're trying to use the Gaia's Blessings proactively, like, no, the Gaia's Blessings here are actually passive cards. You might cast one if it gets stuck in your hand, but for the most part, you're not really worried about casting Gaia's Blessing. You're having it proc off of your Oath of Druids, I think.
There's a very subtle instance here that is not necessarily guaranteed, but does have some amount of if one Gaia's Blessing gets countered and the game becomes about needing to not deck in that way. Let me just finish the quick thing on Ivory Tower with Ivory Tower versus Zeranorb. The choice of Ivory Tower suggests that the way to use the Ivory Tower is by Gushgeddoning, not by like setting up a bunch of lands and then cycling them back in with Gaia's Blessing after the fact by gaining a bunch of life. So the play pattern of like, okay, I will float my mana, I will sack the mana, and then I will get in is a different thing for what you would then want to do as a follow-up versus I'm going to float my mana, gush, and then get in, and then set up for like the follow-up on the Scroll Rack. Like that is a play pattern difference of like how you want to put lands into play and how you would like you are navigating to the point of trying to gush get in, not trying to navigate to what if it were Zeranorb to go Zeranorb and then recycle and then like go along that way. So subtle choice there, but like indicative of like how I would presume that the correct way to pilot.
It's heads up deck building,
Yeah, when you're looking and being like, do I want this or do I not want this? It's like, okay, well, if I have to Armageddon but I can't gush, then I don't think this Ivory Tower is something that's going to be useful to me. Whereas like if you had the Zeranorb in that spot, like it could be, but like those are different patterns. So like this deck is going to look at a lot of cards and it's going to have a lot of different combinations of what it can piece together, and just knowing like how something is supposed to operate in terms of like I sequence this into this, that way I can, accomplish the follow-up after the fact for whatever the goal is. Like the card choices here are indicative of what that looks like, which may not be obvious at first glance if you don't have a lot of reps. And I hope that like, when SWV listens to this, that he's like, hey, actually, like, here's something else that you didn't think of.
I would certainly, I'll certainly like those notes.
And then we'll do the follow-up. Speaking to the 2 Gaia's Blessing versus 3, and, there have been times where I've even played 4 Gaia's Blessings, just as a more weight, because I just wanted more graveyard hate. I was playing like Phyrexian Furnace. Like I've teched out a Phyrexian Furnace as part of the tutor package, because like the cool thing about Gaia's Blessing, and it's my sort of love for Thwart, Mystic Sanctuary, and Legacy, is that when you can go forever, which is what Gaia's Blessing presumes, once you've presented one effect in your deck, theoretically you can then have that effect as many times as you want if the game were to go forever. And I really that really empowers me as a control mage to know that like I can spend this resource now when I need to deal with a problem without having to think, oh, but what if I'm going to need this thing later? And then I don't have that option available to me, knowing that I can just, go through my deck multiple times always, and then always refine that answer potentially. It gives you, it loosens up the shackles of like when you can pick and choose your spots. So for 2 Gaia's Blessing versus 3, when I was only playing 2 Gaia's Blessing, I also had at least 1 predict in my deck. And the rationale for that was if I have Scroll Rack and then for some reason, I get my first Guy's Blessing either countered or I, cast it and then it was removed off of my opponent's furnace, or they had a Tormod's Crypt or some other means to exile it from the graveyard, then at least I know that I could always shuffle my graveyard back in, because I could always stack the Guy's Blessing on top and then mill it away with a Predict. And then that would always ensure that I didn't need then the third Guy's Blessing to shuffle the second one back in after the first one was exiled, right? So even though this deck doesn't have Predict, it does have a way to mill cards in that it does have Zer's Weirding.
Yeah.
And if your opponent never lets you mills the Guy's Blessing, you can always choose to Scroll Rack it back on top of the deck.
Exactly.
Which so like even like, and then if you get into that position, you're presumably winning the game if it comes down to that, right? Like if it comes down to like, because then you would always just be able to like keep going down where they would make that same choice over and over and over and over and over again. And then you would just ensure that you mill them faster. And then you could always cast the last Guy's Blessing to like cycle back in whatever you had before. So like the fact that there's an incidental mill effect in this deck sort of makes me go, oh, the 2 Guy's Blessing is not as alarming as it then if it didn't have any type of mill effect like that.
And with Zer's Weirding out, you also know whether or not your opponent can counter the Blessing, right? When you draw it, right? And you also know if they have any graveyard hate, which is unlikely to be non-permanent base, but Coffin Purge and stuff like that exists, right? So you would know what's going to happen to that Gaia's Blessing, even if they did give it to you and you had to Scroll Rack it back. You know that Scroll Rack exists in the deck, and you could make that assumption afterwards. So you don't have to like blindly Gaia's Blessing if they don't give it to you with the Zer's Weirding, because you get to see everything that's in their hand. Yeah, so there's a couple really interesting features of this deck. One of them being the whole the like Gush Armageddon part, right? That's obvious as far as like play pattern you can do. But I think that what's super interesting to me is like these lines on Gaia's Blessing and like how Gaia's Blessing makes the deck go, because you do need 2 just to go infinite, right? You have to have the 2 to go infinite. But it basically having this in the deck means that obviously you're never going to run out of cards, but it also means that you have to play Forest. And Forest is a card that is, unless you Armageddon, is always going to be in play because you're doing the Gush shenanigans. So to me, it's like kind of a weird guarantee that like you're definitely going to get to do the thing eventually as far as the Forest is concerned. Like you're always going to have that like static land on the board. Whereas like, and you don't see this in Legacy at all, because Gush doesn't exist in Legacy, but with like Days or something like that, right? In this format, like there are no dual lands, right? So you have to play that Forest, and that Forest becomes this sort of like liability inside of your mana base. But once it's on the board, it's there. It stays.
Yeah, I also want to touch on like if all the things that we've just talked about between Ivory Tower versus Zuranor versus some other form of life gain, and the difference between 2 Gaia's Blessing and 3 Gaia's Blessing, in the matchups where that matters, like he does board a 3rd Gaia's Blessing. So like in the matchups where like that becomes like, if that is a concern, he can go up to the 3rd, and then also incidentally is another graveyard hate piece. So like the notion that like, yeah, I like this version of the deck is not going into the game thinking that the Gaia's Blessing forever is what the deck is trying to do. Like the old Parfait deck, I feel like like it did have the option to go Oath into whatever, right? But that deck really could just be like, I'm just gonna literally have my like the end state of this game is I have my deck in my hand every turn for everything that you do, and I can't deck. So like you are deterministically out of options, because I will always have whatever I need for everything that you do, assuming that I have the tools that are provided to solve whatever your deck is trying to accomplish. And then you would pick and tweak like your bullets to help solve whatever problems you thought you had for whatever matchups you were going into. And, like that was it. Like so, the end game, the end state of that game was I can't die, you can't win. Therefore, would you like to concede? And then we just play super fast until you deck.
Yeah, right? And also not for nothing, Phil, but like your creatures in the deck can attack and win the game. Like I have won a ton of games with with Shard Phoenix. Now, you can't get your Shard Phoenix back.
You can.
I guess you can with Mox Diamonds, right? You can.
Well, that was the thing with the previous in the land tax deck. You had your 4 Undiscovered Paradise and 4 Mox Diamonds, and your end game would get to the position where you just have all of those resources in play because your deck is literally in your hand every turn, and so you would be able to produce triple red so that you would always be able to
have
get
that attacker,
your Shard Phoenix back, and that was like the way that you would end up winning like mirror style stuff.
Yeah, was you can start attacking with your 2/2. You know,
and that was that. I think that was also a nod as to why, like, the one of Phyrexian Furnace instead of an additional Gaia's Blessing came in as a way to like stop that particular thing. I mean, granted, like Phyrexian Furnace also has good utility against like Squee and checking the opponent's graveyard against Replenish is also pretty good.
Well, I'm
like
glad
that was the end state.
Yeah,
like, you would get to triple red and just recur your thing, and know that their removal would never be good enough because they couldn't exile it because you could just sack it in response.
Well, I'm glad you're bringing up the sideboard because we're gonna cut the main episode here, and on Patreon we're gonna talk about sideboarding with this deck. So, let us know what you think in the comments. We really dig this version of deck, SWB's version of Parfait.
Yeah, shout out and thank you to SWB for like doing what we've all been trying to do and finding the most success with it that anybody has had so far, at least from like what I've seen with all the Parfait decks that peruse around online. Like, being proactive as a Gushgeddon plan has been like going up to 2 Geddon is a statement. Like that's clearly a plan, and I appreciate the work that he's doing and actually taking it to the locals and grinding with it.
Yeah. And if you're listening on Patreon, you'll start to hear the sideboard plan for this in just a few. Hey, if you enjoyed this episode, hit the subscribe button. It grows the legacy content ecosystem we all love by relaying to the platform that you are part of our passionate community.
And to go even further, click the links for subscription or to support directly via Patreon to help us create more content for you. Patreon supporters get 4 exclusive extra episodes per month. If you're listening on an audio platform, head over to patreon.com/EternalDurdles.
Thanks so much for your support.
We'll see you in the next one.